Hi, Gershom.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Great. How are you?
Not quite that good, but I'm doing okay. Happy Independence Day, I guess. In Israel, Independence Day was yesterday, is that right?
That's right, yeah. Independence Day was yesterday. So we're all recovering and having the equivalent of the Monday morning blues today.
You mean because it was so euphoric, or what do you do on Independence Day in Israel?
You just have to go back to work after. You're absolutely required to go out and have a picnic and barbecue something. Otherwise, it's not patriotic. And so much so that even though I'm a vegetarian, we barbecued vegetarian kebabs because otherwise we wouldn't be part of the, my family wouldn't be part of the national experience if we didn't barbecue something.
Well, that was very well done then. Good. We should tell people, I guess, you've been on Blogging Heads once before, but that was when you were visiting America, and we were talking about your book, The Accidental Empire, which is about the history of the settler movement. But now you're back in Jerusalem, I guess, where you live. You're the Jerusalem correspondent for The Forward, and you write a number of things, including an Atlantic piece that I want to talk about before this is over. Mm-hmm. Anything I should add?
No, that about does it.
Okay. Well, I've been a little behind on the news. The news I've heard from over there has been a little depressing. For example, I think I recall hearing that Hamas is making noises about kind of officially ending what for at least some time was a pretty effective ceasefire, I guess. Am I confused, or is that not? Are things not getting more ominous on that front?
Well, first of all, I would say that in general, there hasn't been anything too uplifting in the news here on the national political front, and particularly on the Israeli-Palestinian front for quite a while. There was a very fragile ceasefire on the line between the Gaza Strip and Israel. The Hamas had launched a rocket and mortar barrage across the border and is saying that they're going to end their ceasefire. Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, is insisting that this is a one-time event, that he's going to get control of things and that this won't happen again. And this morning's Israeli papers, I got two papers in the morning, and one announced that the army is putting pressure on the Israeli army is putting pressure on the government to launch a major ground offensive in the Gaza Strip to crack down on Hamas, to stop the rocket fire. And the second paper said that the army, the chief of staff, is quite dead set against a major ground operation in the Gaza Strip. So, if nothing else, that's a small lesson in journalism. That's either editorial choice or a choice of sources, but it doesn't leave the reader terribly enlightened about what's actually being discussed in the circles of power.
What are the two papers, the Post and Haaretz, or what?
Haaretz, which is sort of I would say the highbrow, wonkish newspaper, and Yediot Achronot, which is a mass circulation tabloid, which is read by over half of the Israeli public, and tends to be a little bit more, shall we say, yellow in its journalism, and a little bit more militant. So it's not clear to me, reading those two headlines, whether the difference in reporting is a matter of the editorial line of the papers, or whether it's just a matter of two reporters talking to two different extremely off-the-record military sources and getting two different versions of what's going on. I would say, looking at it, that my inclination is to believe that the army is, or that the chief of staff at least, is not eager for a ground operation. There's just been a new military chief of staff appointed. The previous one was disgraced in the war in Lebanon last summer, and the new chief of staff seems to be very cautious and not excited about the idea of getting involved again on the ground in Gaza.
Okay. And, I mean, is it your sense that decline in terms of Hamas manifesting suggesting more radicalism, that is to say, actually doing more mischief. I mean, is that more or less inexorable at this point, given the political situation, which is that Hamas is kind of being more or less frozen out of recognition, at least in the government? Of course, it did well in this election, and in theory you have a unity government, considering of it and Abbas. But nobody's... I mean, the Israeli government and the United States are not kind of recognizing Hamas as a legitimate part of the government, which it would like. I mean, is it your sense that the rest is kind of... Is there any hope for rescuing the situation in the near term, I guess, is the question?
Well, I think that at least one reading of the situation is that this actually reflects tensions within Hamas, which have been going on for quite some time between the relatively pragmatic wing and the more militant wing. The pragmatic, more politically oriented side has agreed to this national unity agreement, is trying to establish itself as a political actor in the party sense, and even though the moment that you participate in politics, particularly being in government, always means compromises. Hamas hasn't given up its basic line, but the very fact of being in a government with Fatah means some sort of, at least tacit acceptance of the possibility of negotiations with Israel. There's a more militant wing, and they don't like that. They don't like that kind of compromise. They don't like the idea of any even implicit possible modus vivendi with Israel. There seems to be tension between the two sides, and so the resumption of rocket fire and attempts at attacks on Israel may be as much related to internal Hamas politics as it is related to wider Palestinian politics or to the Israeli-Palestinian situation. There's just levels upon levels here. It's like one of those Russian dolls with one inside of the other.
And, I mean, is it your sense that accepting Hamas's role in the government in a more formal way would strengthen the hand of the moderates, or would only annoy the radicals even more and lead them to lash out more wildly?
It could do both of those things, actually. It could strengthen the moderates. It could give them the opportunity to show that something can be achieved for the Palestinians through political negotiations. My long experience with the politics here is that when the moderates start reaching achievements which include compromises, the radicals will often try to stop that through violence. That was one of the hallmarks of the whole Oslo process, was that when diplomatic progress was being made, that the Hamas militants were going to try to upset it through terror attacks against Israelis, hoping and often getting a strong Israeli response, which in turn justified in their minds a strong Palestinian response, and the whole cycle of violence would begin over again. So I think that that's one of the things that you have to accept as a given, is that any political progress is going to be accompanied by the efforts of the extremists to upset it.
Yeah, and that's a problem in situations like this generally, which is that the extremists on the two sides are, in a sense, good for each other, right? They provoke actions that are good for themselves, right? I mean, it's good for Hamas's extremists if Israel reacts to provocation violently, and it's good for Israel's extremists if Hamas looks very radical, right?
Absolutely. The hardline wings on each side have an undeclared, I would say even unconscious alliance. The most, again, going back to the Oslo period, the most obvious example of this was that in 1994, a lone Jewish extremist carried out a massacre in the Tomb of the Patriarchs in Hebron, what the Palestinians know as the Ibrahimi Mosque. It murdered 29 Palestinians. 40 days later, at the end of the mourning period, of the Muslim mourning period, Hamas launched its first wave of suicide attacks within Israel. the two sides, the extremists on the two sides, disagree about everything else except for the fact that compromise is unacceptable. They each believe that their side needs a total victory, that the entire land belongs to them, and they were both therefore threatened by a political negotiating process. So the position that this puts any leaders who engage in negotiations in is that they have to be able to explain why they're going to continue to move forward and why they're going to hold their punches even when the extremists are engaging in violence to upset it.
Right. Okay, and speaking of both Hebron and extremists, I gather I had read before Independence Day that there was going to be a showdown in Hebron, maybe involving some settlers. And let me tell you what I recall of this story, and you can tell me where I've got it wrong. I'm sure I've got it wrong somewhere. The backdrop was that the Lebanon War had so weakened Olmert that any attempt he might make to exert a moderating influence on the settler movement just didn't have the strength it might have had at an earlier time. So the settlers were feeling their oats, and they want to start a new settlement in Hebron, as I recall, which, as you noted, it is thought to, contain the tomb of Abraham, which would make it very significant for both religions. More so, I guess, for Judaism than for Islam. But is that and this was supposed to come to a head on Independence Day, which would have been yesterday. And tell me which part of this I got wrong.
Well, there's actually two parallel stories going on here. One is that the that the radical edge of the settlement movement has been looking for a confrontation with the government. It wants to reverse its loss of strength following the withdrawal from Gaza. It wants to reassert the claim to what it regards as the whole land of Israel. And actually, there have been two separate foci of this confrontation. One is in Hebron, in the city of Hebron, which is has been a flashpoint of Israeli-Palestinian tension since 1968, just a year after Israel conquered the West Bank. That's when radical settlers for the first time tried to move into Hebron, one of the major Palestinian cities in the West Bank. The religious significance of the city to both religions has certainly heightened that tension, but the single biggest flashpoint there is the presence of settlers inside the Palestinian city. The settlers recently acquired, perhaps legally, perhaps not legally, another large house in Hebron and moved more people into it. The army said that they didn't have permission to and that they would have to move out, and that's working itself out in the courts, but also in the political system now. At the same time, some of the settlers have been trying to organize to return to one of the four settlements in the West Bank that was also evacuated in the summer of 2005. And they held a march to that settlement yesterday on Independence Day. The government said that they couldn't do that. Thousands of people showed up anyway and marched there. And this morning, from the latest reports, the army evacuated the last of the protesters who marched there on Independence Day. So there's this running set of skirmishes between the government and the radical wing of the settler movement.
Okay, so I did get that wrong. The Independence Day showdown was not in Hebron, but and it sounds like the settlers kind of lost that showdown?
Well, I don't think that that's so clear, because the government had said that they couldn't march there at all. But the government did not send enough troops to the northern West Bank to stop them. And so the march took place anyway. And this is part of the whole history of the settlement movement, is that repeatedly there have been situations in which the government has said no, and which the radical settlers have gone ahead, and the government has been afraid of a confrontation and has let them do what was declared illegal the day before. And each time that happens, it strengthens the confidence of the radicals to believe that if they just keep pushing, they're going to get what they want. And in many occasions, they have. The settlement in Hebron, the original settlement by Jews in Hebron, started with settlers going there illegally, being told that they shouldn't be there, and eventually the government caving in and letting them stay. So they see each time that the government says no and they get away with it as a victory.
Okay. Now, you've been an Israeli citizen how long?
I've been a citizen for about 25 years now.
And do you feel that the settler movement is much stronger at this moment than when you got there, which would have been early 1980s? And as for you, I mean, you're on the left side of the political spectrum. Do you feel more besieged, kind of, than in the old days?
Well, the major thing that's happened is that there's simply a much larger presence of the settlers in the West Bank. Their population has continued to grow. They've become more entrenched, and I don't think it makes it impossible to reverse the settlement project. I don't think it makes it impossible for Israel to give up the West Bank, but each additional family living in the West Bank, owning a house there, makes it more difficult. And from a point of view of sheer numbers, they're much more entrenched, and the Israeli problem with getting out is greater. I mean, we're just getting deeper and deeper into this quagmire. And in that sense, I find it a very frustrating situation. The irony is that on the other side of this story is that if 25 years ago, if you talked about getting out of the West Bank in Israel, it was a much more left-wing position. If 25 years ago, if you said you were in favor of a two-state solution of a Palestinian state next to the Jewish state, it put you at the radical fringes of Israeli society. Whereas today, that's a mainstream position. So, ironically, the right and the left have both gotten stronger, and that's why you see this. That's why you see this continuing series of confrontations.
Right, and you saw this in, Ariel Sharon surprising some people by initiating a unilateral withdrawal with an eye to eventually some sort of two-state solution. Of course, the big difference between right and left is that from the point of view of the right, I gather, the idea is to figure out how much land you can hang on to in the process and have a pretty expansive idea of how much land that is to say land outside the pre-1967 borders in the West Bank. And on the left, at least, I don't know how many people there are who still fit this description, but the idea is you actually want to return to something very, very much like the 1967 borders themselves, the idea being that that's the only way you're going to get the Palestinians to be sufficiently satisfied with the deal that it really does the job of bringing lasting peace, right?
Right. On the left side of Israeli politics is basically saying, if we're not going to go back to the 67 line, we're going to go back to a deal that's based on the 67 line. There might be some small land swaps here and there to slightly reduce the number of settlers we have to evacuate. If we, give up 10 acres here and hold on to 10 acres there, maybe there will be a few thousand fewer settlers who have to be evacuated. And it's true that the major right-wing parties now, center-right and right-wing parties, are talking about giving up some land. Whereas if you went back to the 70s or 80s or even the 90s, the position of the right was give up nothing. So you do have one major difference here inside of the parliamentary system, inside of the party system, which is that you could say that now we're just dickering about the price. I would see that as a major improvement. I think that the right's position is still terribly unrealistic, that their belief that they can hold on to most of the major settlements and still reach any kind of satisfactory peace agreement is a completely unrealistic view. But the fact that they're talking in terms of how much we're going to give up now it reflects a major change in Israeli consciousness. The group of people who are saying that we should hold on to everything has now become marginalized, and that, in a sense, is a major shift of the Israeli mainstream leftward. That also explains why the settlers are so angry and so eager for confrontation, because if at one time they saw themselves as the vanguard, they looked behind them and felt that Israeli society was marching after them, now they feel much more alienated from the Israeli mainstream, and they're angry. They feel abandoned, betrayed by mainstream Israel.
Right, and you just wrote this piece for the Atlantic Monthly about somebody who manifests anger on the right, Lieberman.
Right.
What's his first name?
Avigdor Lieberman.
And he, I guess he first made headlines in America for saying that Arabs within, this is at least a position he held some time ago, I think, Arabs within Israel proper should be more or less expelled. I think some Americans don't actually realize how many Arabs live in Israel proper. And you know, there are whole Arab villages, lots of them within Israel proper.
Right. Between 15 and 20% of the population of Israel within the pre-67 borders are Arabs, and they are citizens of Israel, unlike the residents of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And Lieberman has been seeking a way to essentially disenfranchise them, either physically remove them from Israel or remove Israel from them by changing the borders, or changing the criteria for citizenship such that they would be disenfranchised.
And he is actually part of the government because there was Olmert had to resort to a coalition government involving his far-right party, right? So he has some position. He's minister of something or other.
He is Minister for Strategic Affairs, a role that whose significance remains controversial. He officially has the job of planning Israel's strategic response to threats such as Iran. His entry into the government was a response to Olmert's political weakness following the war in Lebanon last summer. Olmert was afraid that his governing coalition would fall apart, that he'd have to face the electorate in a new national election. He was terrified of that because he was much too unpopular after the war in Lebanon to ever be reelected. And to shore up his population, he brought Lieberman's party into the coalition and gave a cabinet position to this far-right figure.
And Lieberman, as your piece makes clear, one of the things that has powered his ascendancy, such as it is resentment among immigrants, especially recent immigrants from Russia. He is himself an immigrant from Russia, who I guess feel as if they're not truly accepted in Israel, at least some of them. But at the same time, clearly he's tapping into extremists in the settler movement, I'm sure, right? And I guess in a way, I was in a way relieved to hear that he has somewhat moderated his language. I mean, it sounds like lately he's not so much talking about physically expelling Arabs or even literally ending their citizenship. What he wants to do is get them to do a series of rituals that they would find abhorrent, right? Like some kinds of loyalty oaths and officially subscribing to language in the national anthem about the Jewish soul of Israel and so on. It did seem to me that represents some moderation on his part. Maybe that's good news, but in a way, I guess my question for you is, what do you think is the most extreme and alarming part of his position that represents, an appreciable part of the spectrum of Israeli opinion, like, I don't know, 5 to 10%, right? If that question makes sense. Well, what should we be most worried about what he signifies?
Well, he received close to 10% of the national vote, so until the next election, I think we can relate to him as representing at least that part of the electorate. And he represents a position which, in one way or another, wants to exclude the Arab citizens of Israel from the Israeli democracy, whether that's by physically ejecting them as he said it first, or if that's by forcing them to take a loyalty oath, which would be so offensive that very few of them would want to do it. He is essentially trying to change Israel from a Jewish majority country to a Jews-only country. In that sense, even though he's an immigrant, ironically, there's a lot of parallels between his political position and the political position of some of the far-rightists in Europe who run on an anti-immigrant campaign. He's essentially talking about this country belongs to one ethnic group, and anybody who's part of a different ethnic or religious group is not really part of Israel and should be excluded. So I think that he's speaking a language which is very similar to far-rightists in Europe, and the fact that he's managed to garner as much support as he has is troubling. The fact that he's been taken into the governing coalition is troubling. One has to look at it carefully. It's not as if he's a majority party. It's not as if he's got the kind of support of one of the two parties in the American system. But the fact that he could get 9 or 10% of the vote in a national election is certainly cause for serious concern.
Okay. Now, in the midst of all of this mostly depressing news, is it your sense that Condi Rice is doing any good or has serious hopes of doing good? I mean, she, for a while at least, was showing, and I still think she harbors hopes of doing some kind of serious shuttle diplomacy, perhaps somewhat to the irritation of the Israeli government, because she... I gather she wants to bring a kind of communication between Israel and the Palestinians that, while not officially involving recognition of the role of Hamas in the government, manages to make Hamas feel a little involved enough for the whole thing not to fall apart. Is that your sense of what she would like?
Well, there were indications in the last couple of months that she wanted to get serious about an American role of facilitating negotiations and pushing forward and trying to get some sort of serious negotiations that would at least lead in the direction of a new diplomatic arrangement between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Maybe not getting all the way to a final peace agreement, but at least working in that direction. But as has happened almost consistently with the Bush administration, you saw these, come over here, conduct talks, and then she seems to fade out again. And that, of course, raises the major question of whether she has any support for that kind of diplomacy from her boss. One way of moving forward on the Israeli-Arab peace front is my very, very serious involvement by the American president. That can be expressed by the president himself coming over here, or that can be expressed by a negotiator who clearly has presidential prestige, such as Kissinger did in the 70s when he conducted his shuttle diplomacy. When Kissinger was negotiating between Israel, Egypt, and Syria, it was clear that the full backing of the administration was there. I don't think that anybody feels yet that Condoleezza Rice has that kind of presidential momentum behind her. I can't get the feeling that the Bush administration has really made a decision to make a diplomatic push for a new Israeli-Arab peace process. I haven't seen the signs yet that the Bush administration really takes diplomacy seriously, to tell you the truth.
Yeah.
To underline
no,
the point.
I wouldn't either. I mean, the only good news is that some of the seeming obstacles to that kind of approach within the administration are no longer there. The personnel has changed in a way that I would say has moved the administration away from neoconservatism toward a kind of traditional Republican realism, but probably not far enough. And in any event, I think you may have isolated the question is, well, what is Bush himself thinking, if much of anything on this front? I mean, he's preoccupied with Iraq. He had essentially no understanding of the area when he first started running for president. So I'm not going to try to inflict a lot of optimism on you here.
I mean, I look. My own sense is that if there's going to be a new serious re-engagement of the United States toward Israeli-Palestinian, or for that matter, Israeli-Syrian peace, I can put a date on when I expect that to start, and it's January 20th, 2009. I would love to be surprised before that date. I think that the American role would be essential here. I just don't see any indication to take that seriously yet, to take that possibility seriously yet. The change of personnel, I think, that would make that possible, seems to me, looking at it from Jerusalem, would be a change of personnel at the very top in the United States, and that obviously isn't going to happen before 2009.
And it definitely will happen then, so...
Right. Right, so I've got a date for my optimism here. I mean, it's something that I can mark on my calendar to start looking at what's happening diplomatically after that date. Unfortunately, I think a lot of bad things can happen in our region before then, but I just don't have any reason to think that...
I've got some other bad news for you. A lot of bad things can happen in America after that. I mean, depending on who's elected, but go ahead, sorry.
Right, but what I'm saying is that's when the game opens up again.
Yeah.
And you know, you made a comment before about Republican realism. I think I would put it differently. I think that until 2000, through 2000, if you look all the way from 1967 to 2000, there was what I would call a bipartisan American policy toward the Israeli-Arab problem, and that bipartisan policy was that the United States wanted to see a negotiated settlement between Israel and the Arabs based more or less on the 1967 lines. And that goal was pursued sometimes vigorously and sometimes not, depending on how tied up the United States was in other parts of the world, who was in the White House. But the goal was, I think, fairly consistent. And that's part of the reason why sometimes diplomats could very easily stay over from one administration to another. A lot of the professionals stayed over from the Johnson to the Nixon administration. A lot of professionals stayed over from the Bush 1 administration to the Clinton administration, because the basic bottom line was that it was in America's interest for there to be a peace settlement. That would allow that would create stability in the region. It would exclude the radicals who were against American interests, and it would allow America to strengthen its relationship both with the moderate Arab countries and with the United States. That bipartisan policy seems to have gone AWOL in 2001. I'm just hoping that it's rescued under the next administration.
Well, another thing that happened in 2001, on September 11th, to be more specific, is something that in theory should have, it seems to me, only driven home to Americans how important it is to secure a lasting peace for Israel. You know, what I mean is that so long as that problem festers, there will be more anger in the Arab and or Muslim world, and some of that will be directed at America and can lead to anti-American terrorism. And I think the danger for Israel is that if the problem as things continue and the problem seems more and more hopeless, you'll start to see in America people who just want to try to separate themselves from the problem and withdraw entirely and cease to see America's interest as tied up with Israel's, which I think is just a profound mistake, because I think always there will just be this linkage, and always it will be in America's interest for Israel to find lasting peace. But I've got to say, if the message has not been driven home to us by 9/11, how important this is, I don't know what it would take, and that's what depresses me. Is just how little enlightenment has actually flowed out of what happened.
Well, you know, it's an interesting thing with 9/11. In a sense, it was a recasting on the international stage. What it seems to me, as you know, a citizen of two countries, in my American memory, as an old American domestic debate about crime. Do you deal with crime only by sending out a posse, or do you also look at what conditions create crime? There's extreme positions either way there. I wouldn't, even if I were, you know, trying to eradicate poverty, I wouldn't close down the police department. But there's always been a sort of law and order view of crime that just says the only thing that's necessary is more cops and more guns to the cops, and if that's not enough, hand out guns to the citizens and so forth, versus a view that says, well, if we improved education, if we improved the job situation, if we took a societal view of what causes crime, we could at least reduce some of the forces that lead to crime. After 9/11, the whole war on terror, or even crusade against terror rhetoric, said we don't have to look at the causes. These are just bad guys, and we're going to go get them. And what's even stranger about the way the administration has dealt with this is that they've also taken the attitude of once a bad guy, always a bad guy, so that when opportunities have come up for a diplomatic engagement, for instance, with Syria, the Bush administration's response seems to be, well, they're bad guys, so we can't talk to them. Well, what about the possibility that you could, with a carrot and a stick, get them on the side of the good guys and change the balance of forces? That whole way of thinking seems to have been absent.
Yeah. In a way, I wish the law and order analogy held more strictly, which is to say that in the case of the law and order thing domestically, at least aggressive policing tends not to exacerbate the underlying problem of crime, right? It's not like people rob stores because they're upset at how heavy-handed the police are being. Whereas in the war on terror...
But they might have a riot.
Well, they could, but that's at least a new kind of crime. I mean, in this case, it seems to me the fundamental problem we face, which is hatred of Israel and hatred of America, tends to be exacerbated not by any policing action, by any means, but by recklessly aggressive policing actions. Take the Iraq War, for example. But anyway, when we're talking to each other about this, we're preaching to the converted, so...
Right.
And that tends not to succeed in convincing any unconverteds that are out there watching, and there are some, as the comments section will probably reveal. But I wanted to ask you, you mentioned that there will be a change of leadership in America. When we talked before this about things you'd like to discuss, I think you said you were interested in this whole phenomenon of kind of which American presidents are considered good for Israel, pro-Israel. I've got to tell you, I was kind of surprised. I guess I was fooling around on the, I call it Haaretz, but I guess that's the wrong pronunciation for that newspaper. Haaretz. Haaretz is the Hebrew?
Yeah. It's
considered a left-wing newspaper, but I came across this page. Is the guy's name Rossner or something? Does that ring a bell?
Yes.
There's a page where there's an official ranking of American presidential candidates in terms of how good they are for Israel. And it changes on a regular basis. Like if one of them forgets to say, we will never drag Israel to the negotiating table, I guess they lose like a half a point or something, And what struck me is that I had always heard it was a left-wing newspaper. The ranking seemed to be the kind of ranking a conservative. It seemed like a kind of right-wing ranking, if that makes sense to you. I mean, I don't really know what the basis for ranking is anyway. The presidential candidates tend to say very much the same thing on this. So they have official things they feel they're supposed to say and official things they feel they're not supposed to say. And they mostly stick to the rules. But for whatever reason, some are thought to be, in some sense, more pro-Israel than others. And that ranking I saw on the Haaretz site seemed to me to correspond with the ranking you would get from, a right-winger in America or Israel. So can you explain the whole situation to me?
Well, I would guess that that's the ranking of the columnist and not of the newspaper. The newspaper is a left-wing newspaper. If I look, for instance, at the writing of their senior diplomatic commentator, Akiva Eldar, you'd get a very different picture of what's good or bad for Israel in terms of American politics. I would certainly say that this idea that what's good for Israel is just supporting the hardest line position possible is obsolete. The whole way that the American debate is phrased about what's good for Israel or not, frankly, from here strikes me as strange because it often seems like American politicians are racing to put themselves on the right side of the Israeli political spectrum, and that comments that would be accepted as normal politics here are considered out of bounds or trafe the American political debate. I find that a little bit bizarre, to tell you the
What's
truth.
an example of something a centrist could say in Israel that an American presidential candidate cannot say, or maybe something slightly left of center that an American presidential candidate who's slightly left of center can't say?
Well, I think that we already discussed that, that America should be playing an active role in negotiating a Israeli-Palestinian peace, and that peace is probably going to be involve Israel pulling back from most of the West Bank. Within the Israeli political spectrum, that's a fairly accepted mainstream, perhaps a little bit left of center position, but certainly nothing surprising. If negotiations like that were to take place, there'd clearly have to be a major American role. And it would be seen as being supportive to Israel for the United States to get involved and bang heads together to make that happen. I'll put it this way. The basic perception here is that a peace agreement from a Israeli perspective, from the center leftward, is a win-win situation for Israel. It's not a matter of you're favoring the Arabs by pushing for a peace agreement, or you're favoring Israel by pushing for a peace agreement. You're favoring both sides. That's a win-win thing. And therefore, it's not negative for Israel to say that you think that's essential. Obviously, one of the reasons that such an agreement hasn't taken place is all sorts of intransigence on the Arab side as well. To blame everything on Israel would be unfair, but it's certainly not a bad thing for America to get involved and start pushing toward that.
Yeah, I mean, I think a presidential candidate can say something very much like what you said. In fact, I should look at this speech Obama just delivered. I'm pretty sure he did say we need to take an assertive role, and it's certainly, I think it's certainly legit to say ultimately you want a two-state solution on something, close to the 1967 borders. I think the trouble comes when you do start having to bang heads together. In the real world. And you have to be very careful about how you describe the relative, allocation of blame between the two sides and how you describe America's role. Like you're allowed to say America should be an honest broker, but there's some formulation that Howard Dean used that got him into a lot of trouble. It was something like America shouldn't play favorites between Israel and the Palestinians or something. Which sounds, it boils down to being an honest broker, kind of, but it's not. You're not well advised to put it that way. So I don't know. It'll be interesting to hear how the debate shapes up, and there's all kinds of debate about why presidential candidates feel the constraints that they do. Because it's often said that if you actually look at the spectrum of American Jewish opinion, it's not really right wing on this issue. And there's all kinds of debate over whether they fear, AIPAC per se or Jewish opinion per se or what. But we'll see. I haven't actually. Obama just gave this speech. I haven't seen what he said exactly.
Well, one thing that was very interesting on that count was that before the 2004 elections, there was a tremendous amount of hype from the Republicans that Bush's pro-Israel positions were going to finally lead to the great shift of Jews to the Republican Party, right? This was all over the place. The Republican spinmeisters were putting this out very seriously. And one of the things that's interesting was that, at least according to the polling data, the percentage of the Jewish vote that went to Bush in 2004 increased slightly, but not by any significant amount. And Bush did much more poorly, for instance, in his re-election bid among the Jews than Reagan or Nixon did on this pro-Israel, on this claim of being pro-Israel. So several factors could have been at work. Either the Jewish community was so sick of Bush because of everything else that wasn't enough to change anybody's mind. That's possible. Or, in fact, that a large portion of the American Jewish electorate didn't really buy that simply getting out of the Middle East diplomatically was really such a pro-Israel position.
Yeah. No, I guess that's reassuring.
I think it's something that the Democrats should take cognizance of when they're figuring out what they're going to say about the Middle East in this campaign. That the platitudes may not be as popular as the conventional wisdom says they are.
Yeah, I think the candidates consider this such delicate terrain, they're almost afraid to probe and find out what the underlying landscape of opinion actually is. Okay, Gershom, we're back, right?
Yes.
You're with us. Okay, we had a little cable come unplugged there. But I wanted to, before we go, we've talked a while already. Before we go, I want to ask you about a recent incident that, from America's point of view, was very intriguing and kind of puzzling, which was Nancy Pelosi's trip over there. I mean, first of all, she visited Israel, then went to Syria, and for one thing, she caught a little flack for just kind of going to Syria. But the thing that puzzled me was she went to Syria kind of saying she had a message from the Israeli prime minister that Israel was interested in talking to Syria, and then so I guess she delivered that message to Assad, came out and told the press she had delivered the message, at which point the Israeli prime minister's office said, well, no, I mean, our position has not changed, which is that discussions with Syria would be premised on a change in their behavior, right? That's kind of, is that what happened, as you recall it?
Well, that's certainly how the reports went, and I would go through this stage by stage. First of all, I think it was a good thing for her to go to Israel and Syria. She was essentially creating the sort of connections that the administration has refrained from making. She was pointing out the fact that there are separate parties here who need to be talked to get engaged in order for anything to move forward. My guess is that what happened is that when she talked to Olmert, he made some platitudes about how Israel is always interested in peace, and of course we'd be willing to have peace with the Syrians, and then threw some qualifications in there. And she emphasized the positive when she went to Damascus, and Olmert was unhappy with that. I think part of the reason that Olmert wasn't happy with that is that Olmert has been saying that he doesn't want to talk to Syria because the American administration doesn't want him to talk to Syria. A couple of months ago, when it came out that there had been some unofficial backtrack negotiations between the former Director General of the Israeli Foreign Ministry and an unofficial Syrian representative, and Olmert was asked why he wasn't interested, at least the off-the-record comments were that he wasn't interested because Bush wasn't interested. So he may have been trying to show that he hadn't suddenly changed his stripes for the Democrat coming through. But I think that this was unwise on his part, and it followed a pattern of unwise behavior in the sense that he has identified himself very, very closely, not just with an alliance with the United States, but specifically with an alliance with the Bush administration, to the extent that he continues to say positive things about how wonderful the war in Iraq has been for Israel. Besides the fact that all the strategic analysts are now talking about how terrible the war in Iraq has been for Israel, he's tying himself to a sinking ship politically in the United States, and he's identifying himself with one party within the United States, which is certainly not wise for an Israeli leader to do. Political diplomatic wisdom would suggest that the best thing for an Israeli leader to do is to be on good terms with both parties. So a public rift with Pelosi was certainly not the better part of wisdom.
Well, there was some cynical theorizing over here. Not so much, it wasn't that prominent, but as far as what happened with Pelosi, that had to do with his ties to the Bush administration. The idea being that, whatever he told Pelosi, he may have gotten a message from the Bush administration that, look, we are not eager for Nancy Pelosi to suddenly, look like Metternich or something. well, we aren't eager for her to come out of this looking great. It's kind of hard for me to believe they actually placed a phone call and said, could you make her look bad? But there may have been some sense that if Olmert is going to, if he's in an alliance with Bush, what Bush would like is for Olmert not to do Pelosi any favors. I don't know. At the same time, I'd say that, Pelosi, it seems to me one way or another, you got to say she screwed up. I mean, if you're going to go out and you're on the diplomatic stage and you're going to characterize something that the Israeli prime minister told you in a very delicate context, you better pretty much get it in writing, right? I mean, you better be very clear that what you're saying is exactly what he not only authorized you to tell Assad, but authorized you to tell the public. And it seems to be the one way or another, Nancy Pelosi needs a little more experience on the foreign policy stage, although maybe after this she doesn't.
Well, I think, as I said, my hypothesis was that she didn't hear the qualifications, that she didn't hear that first came the platitudes, and after the platitudes, after the comma, the qualifications are the real message. And if that's what happened, it certainly shows a lack of diplomatic finesse. I tend to doubt that somebody from the Bush administration called up and said, okay, now you can put the knife in her back. One of the reasons I doubt that is that the Israeli government leaks like a sieve, and if it had happened, I would have expected to see a report about it already. But but she was trying to look like the peacemaker and did poorly at it. And at the same time, Olmert created the enmity of, or at least deeply irritated many people in the Democratic Party. And if he has any hope of still being in office a couple of years from now, which he at least hopes for, I don't know if that's a realistic hope, then he should take into account that these may be the people who will be sitting in the White House and in the State Department, and be more careful. But as I said, I was at a speech by Olmert a couple of weeks after the midterm elections in the United States, in which he was praising, to an American Jewish group, in which he was praising the war in Iraq. And I thought, did the guy read the newspaper? Does he know what Americans just voted? This is not diplomatically wise. Nobody was asking him to. He didn't need to say that. He could have avoided the subject. It didn't need to be on the agenda for that talk. So, from both sides, I think there was some serious mishandling of the situation.
Yeah, I don't. That's kind of funny because, for one thing, I actually don't think before the Iraq War that among kind of Israeli strategic thinkers there was as much optimism about the war as there was, kind of on the American right, or as much hope that in the end it actually would necessarily. I think there was much more awareness of the pitfalls, partly because it's their neighborhood.
I had a conversation with an Israeli colonel 2 weeks after the war began in Iraq, 2 weeks after the invasion began, a man who is far from being a dovish figure. And he said to me that he'd had a conversation with a top American official 2 months before that, in which he'd said, all right, you go in and you conquer it, and after that you have Fedayun. After that you have an insurrection. What's your plan for that? And the guy looked at him and didn't know what he was talking about. So the Israeli was saying, conquering is the easy part. Occupation is the difficult part. That's one thing we've learned in all these years, is that occupation is the difficult part. And he was shocked that this wasn't part of the American war plan. And this, as I said, it wasn't by a peacenik who was telling me this. It was somebody who was very far from that. I saw that as a reflection of the fact that there was a lot of more skepticism, doubts, questions about the whole thing. Certainly when the invasion itself was going on, the Israeli media expressed a lot more questions than the American media was expressing at the time, which was, of course, incredibly ironic, considering all the voices that said this is being done for Israel.
Right.
So the American perception that this was being done for Israel and the way the debate about it was going on in Israel itself did not fit together.
Right, and leaving aside an awareness of the pitfalls of the invasion, I don't think Israel considered Iraq the biggest problem it faced in the region. I mean, Saddam Hussein was making this big deal of giving $25,000 to the families of suicide bombers, which you'd rather he didn't do. But certainly, I think Israel considered Iran a bigger strategic threat than Iraq.
There has been one report that Sharon himself, a report from a fairly reliable source, that Sharon himself said to Bush before the war in Iraq, "You're going for the wrong target." Just to say that Sharon had no problems with international interventions, that he was the last man to be against rearranging regimes. He just thought that Bush was choosing the wrong target. I would call that the hawkish side of Israeli skepticism. On the other side, there was the view that this whole concept that you were going to create an instant democracy in Iraq was foolish, that it was destabilizing, and that instability in the Middle East is never in Israel's interest. And, of course, that kind of doubt has been borne out. I mean, the most obvious example is that the chaos in Iraq threatens Jordan, and Jordanian stability is a top Israeli strategic interest. It threatens Turkey, for that matter, and Israel's two closest strategic partners in the Middle East are Jordan and Turkey. So causing a threat to Jordan and Turkey is a threat to Israel. The fact that the American planning didn't seem to take those risks into account was certainly not in any way in Israel's interest. I would say that's another example of the fact that many things that play as being pro-Israel are in Israeli interest, almost in an accepted conventional wisdom way in the American context, don't look that way when seen from Israel itself.
Yeah, I mean, there's also the question of, suppose we had succeeded in implanting democracy in Iraq, what are the chances that the people, once they had the power to shape policy as people actually do in a democracy, were going to approve of the American strategic agenda, which in the game plan we were going to be exercising from military bases in Iraq? And that's I think sooner or later that's a problem that would have cropped up, because we did plan to do both things. We were not very explicit about wanting to establish these long-term bases and use them to intimidate Iraq's neighbors and so on. But no one here in America doubts that was part of the game plan. And ultimately, I think reconciling that with true democracy in Iraq, if it had actually transpired, would have been a little bit of a balancing act itself.
Well, it certainly was a problem in the sense that if you look at what the American military presence in Saudi Arabia has done, it's become the rallying point for radicals, for Al-Qaeda. That's even with the regime remaining intact, without the kind of madness that you see in Iraq. So the goal of, let me put it this way, the goal of creating a stable pro-Western regime and the goal of having American military bases there seemed to me to be a contradiction to begin with. The assumption that a democracy is going to be pro-American is also difficult to fathom. In fact, one of the major problems that Israel is facing right now is that democratic elections were held in the Palestinian Authority and the Muslim radicals won. I'm not quite sure what they thought in Washington. Did they assume that the Iraqi constitutional system would include a Supreme Court that would make sure that the elections came out the right way? I don't know.
But I think ultimately, I mean, one answer would be, well, it's part of neoconservative American ideology that democracy is good and democracy always works. That's one view. Another view is that actually they say that, but they don't mean it. I think in any event, Bush meant it. He picked up on that, and the guy knew virtually nothing about world affairs when he came into office, and I think he just latched on to the democracy idea and was not sophisticated enough to understand what a complicated, how many complications can ensue when you try to implant democracy in any given place kind of suddenly. But I guess you and I are both going to go out on a limb and venture the judgment that the Iraq invasion was maybe not a good idea.
Well, I think I'll risk going that far out on a limb. Yes.
Well, That's what we get paid for, is to make the tough calls, you know?
Right, exactly.
Oh, wait, you're not getting paid. I forgot. Okay.
Right.
And neither am I. Okay, well, anyway, that's what we would get paid for if we got paid.
Right.
Okay,
but I will
well,
say
listen.
this is that in a mere 30 or 40 years, we should both live and be healthy. The archives will open up, and we'll actually get a look at what was discussed at those meetings, and we'll probably be even more surprised at how silly everything was.
I think that's safe to say. And of course, by that time, we will have destroyed our own archives here at Blogging Heads, so we won't be looking as foolish as otherwise we would be. Well, you know, I want to thank you for spending the time. It's great. It's great to have a perspective from Jerusalem, especially one that happens to coincide with mine and on some key points. I want to ask you, before we go, you said you referred to your vegetarian barbecue on Israel's Independence Day. Why? I mean, usually, there are a couple of reasons you can be a vegetarian. Some people do it for the moral reasons. And those tend to be weak-kneed liberals, I guess I would say. Some people do it for the health reasons. What's your constellation of reasons for being a vegetarian?
Well, I became vegetarian both out of a dislike of eating meat and the environmental reasons, the idea that eating meat is wasteful of the environment. I admit that it was made easier for me that back in the United States, I went to college for 3 years in a town where it was impossible to buy kosher meat, and I keep kosher, so for those 3 years I hardly ate meat anyway, and by the end of that time it was much easier to give up meat because I hadn't been eating it anyway. So it was one of those easy, weak-kneed liberal choices.
So it's all of the above, except maybe the health thing didn't factor in real big time.
Yeah.
What town was this that didn't have kosher food?
Santa Cruz, California.
Santa Cruz?
Yeah.
Wow. You are a crazy hippie, aren't you? You went to UC Santa Cruz?
That's right.
Oh, I don't think anything you say should be trusted then. I had no idea what a
Fringe
character you were.
I'll leave that to your judgment. Actually, I think that anything that comes from Santa Cruz is increased reliability, but we'll leave that to the judgment of the viewers.
Yeah, I'm actually surprised that any form of meat was available in Santa Cruz. Isn't there a law that you have to be a vegetarian there or something?
No, it's just assumed that you will be. It's like in the 1972 American presidential elections, the on-campus precincts at Santa Cruz voted 98% for McGovern, and the assumption was that the other 2% was due to people who were not close enough to planet Earth to be able to read their ballots correctly.
Yeah. Okay. Well, anyway, you seem to have recovered from that experience. You sound like actually, in many ways a sober and rational person. So it may have just been a temporary aberration.
Right.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot, and let's do this again.
Wonderful. Good talking to you, Bob.
Okay.